Rich, my joke was before we came back, if the UK ever has two new decent companies that are trying to do something, maybe we'll block them. But that probably isn't likely anytime soon. But what's the deal here?
I think there's a bigger problem just globally.
Which is?
I mean, we're seeing more and more transactions being blocked of companies that don't really seem bad for consumers. I mean, cloud gaming is a nascent market even today. I think Brandon Ross, my partner, has written pretty extensively about this. This transaction is not anti-consumer. There's not, I think the market definition that regulators are using and have looked to both in the U.S. and abroad, obviously with Great Britain, are just flawed. And so we'll see. I think it's going to be interesting what happens from here. But the market definitions and the fear of sort of restriction of competition just seem completely unfounded. It's just, again, very, very disappointing.
Rich, we've seen this movie before, not necessarily in the UK, but the EU and in socialism land, they don't care about consumers. They care about, they have some idea that employees at antiquated companies should never lose their jobs because they might, in a restructuring, you might move forward into the future and things change. There won't be any buggy whip makers. There'd still be buggy whip makers in the EU.
Look, I've seen senators recently write letters attacking the Warner Brothers Discovery merger, unhappy with layoffs, as if there isn't layoffs across not just media, old media, big tech, Netflix, Google. I mean, the whole thing is essentially absurd.
I mean, catalytic converter employees might, the Biden administration might put a few of those people out of business, I think.
Why don't we stop AI innovation because we're worried about what it does to certain jobs? I mean, it's just, again, it's hard to stop technology.
Rich,
and when you leave.
Here's the thing I can't figure out. There's a view right now that this Biden administration here in the United States is anti-deal making, right? And there's a whole bunch of companies, especially in the media space and tech space, as you know very well, that think, okay, maybe if there's a different administration in 24, that the world would somehow be different. We talk about, future of Warner Brothers Discovery or Paramount, and whether a Comcast, parent company of this network, could do something, or Microsoft could do something. Some of the tech companies could buy things. But then I start to think to myself, if former President Trump becomes the president again, it's not so clear that he's so happy about media mergers. He's never been happy about media mergers. We've seen that before. DeSantis in Florida has been making life quite miserable for Disney. So do you think that on both political sides, it has moved in this sort of unique direction, or something else is happening?
Well, I would almost leave this almost as an aside, Andrew, is like it's actually more challenging overseas, right? I mean, just yesterday, Daniel Ek at Spotify was talking about how, he was disappointed in the Apple ruling against Epic in the U.S., but that they're seeing a lot more traction with their case and their sort of view of sort of the challenges of big tech overseas. And so you've seen sort of European governments, whether it's EU, obviously this case UK, have been far more difficult for big tech companies to navigate. And I think that's part of what you're seeing today. And I think sort of that global landscape. Remember, all of the companies that you and I have been talking about are global. And so it's not just about U.S. approval. You need global approvals.
But is therefore your takeaway that for the next decade, when you look forward between whatever you think is happening in Europe right now and potentially whatever you think is happening in the U.S., that actually deal making is not, there's not some closed window now that somehow opens later?
I don't know, but I think it certainly advantages some of the smaller companies that certainly aren't threatened by this. Like, you never hear the word Snapchat when you think about regulatory pushback. They don't fall into that conversation that the Googles, the Metas, the Amazons, the Microsofts fall into. And so you actually have sort of this unique opportunity where some of the smaller companies. But they don't have the balance sheet either. They don't, but they're starting to grow again. Things are getting better, and they don't have that sort of fund. They're not looking to sell, so I don't think they're selling themselves to one of those big companies.
But to the extent that you're saying that they're a buyer, I'm saying that it's still not a business that has the balance sheet to start, becoming rolling up businesses.
No, but as they grow, they certainly have the ability to make acquisitions without the threat. I mean, Facebook, Meta couldn't even, remember they had to go to court to buy a small VR gaming company called Within. It's just they couldn't buy Giphy. They had to literally get out of Giphy because the UK government thought Meta buying this little tiny couple $100 million company was somehow threatening the market. So the ability to make small acquisitions, I think you shouldn't dismiss it. I think it is an advantage for some of these companies that don't have that sort of regulatory threat that we're seeing from the giants.
Let's say for a moment and stipulate that it's possible this deal doesn't happen. What happens to the future of Activision Blizzard in your mind?
Look, I think Brandon Ross, my partner, has been very clear. I think things are going well at Activision, and Bobby has a plan. And so there is this view that this deal falling apart could actually bode well for what's happening at Activision in 24. Investors may not feel that this morning, but I'm not sure he believes that the people will be all that disappointed.
Are you now of the view that Bobby sold out too cheap?
I think things are going very, I think there's definitely a 24 story that he's excited for Bobby to show.
Do you see a possibility of Activision being a buyer in the future, if that was the case?
That's a great question. I mean, obviously, you've seen greater consolidation in the space. I mean, Activision made a great purchase of King. I think you probably would look at, Take-Two's purchase of Zynga has not gone nearly as well. But could there be more consolidation? Sure. I mean, I think that's certainly not out of the question at all.
And then does this just stop Microsoft from any more deals in this? What does it do to the future of their gaming product?
It's a great question. It is not my core focus, so it really would be more of a question for my partner Brandon. I mean, I think the reality is a lot of the cloud gaming stuff, hasn't really translated. I think in terms of where you see Microsoft go and build from here. I mean, both companies. This was a very logical merger that seemed to be very good for consumers, and it still sort of baffles us why we're even talking about this transaction being blocked.